So please state your name, where you were born, and where you grew up.
My name is Royal Orr. I was born in Sherbrooke, in the Sherbrooke Hospital in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and I grew up in a little tiny village south of Sherbrooke called Milby, and went to Alexander Galt Regional High School when it first opened, and Champlain College and Bishop's University, and then headed off for graduate school.
What was your line of work before getting involved in Alliance Quebec?
Right to Alliance Quebec.
Before.
Yeah. When I came out of university, I went back to the townships intending to farm. I mean, I bought a farm, and my family were farmers. My older brother got the home farm. So I purchased this kind of bear farm in Hatley, and started building a flock of sheep, which we got up to about 150 before we sold them. So I was farming, and I was then just picking up whatever work I could get. So I taught for a little bit at Champlain College, teaching English. I taught music. I was the music specialist for a year at the elementary school in Richmond. I'd become involved with the Townshippers Association on the first board of directors when that was set up. And then they asked me to be their executive director, and I was executive director, the second executive director of the Townshippers Association for 3 or 4 years. Then I was invited to go and do the morning show in Quebec City for CBC, which I did for a few months, several months. And then I went back to the Eastern Townships. I mean, I kept the farm. And Michael Goldblum asked me to be what was called the off-island vice president when he became president of Alliance Quebec. So that's when I started in close with Alliance Quebec, and then went on to be president after being VP.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about Townshippers, like how that was formed, how you were involved, how you got involved with that?
Yeah, they always used to joke that it was Dr. Camille Laurent who was responsible for creating Townshippers Association. He began, I guess you'd say a charm offensive, but it's hard to think about Dr. Laurent doing a charm offensive, but he was tasked with doing a charm offensive with the English-speaking community. And so he held a meeting. I was still just moving back from McMaster University. I was in Ontario for a year studying with George Grant. And so when I arrived back, the kind of public meeting had taken place, but they were just kind of establishing the structures of the organization in 1979, late 1979. And so they asked me to be on the board, and I became involved. First of all, the first stuff I was involved with was kind of like cultural stuff, and one of the first projects we did was to document and begin to clear the abandoned cemeteries across the townships, which ended up being like a pretty big project. And then I was involved with a bit of a battle, because following Bill 101, they set up new rules about toponymy, about place names. And they started this process. It was one of the first things to flow out of Bill 101, and they started this process of basically translating the names of all the toponyms, and like all the town names and mountain names and river names and everything. And so they were doing things like dropping apostrophes from Mose River and sticking hyphens and everything. And they even at one point said they were going to change the name of Owl's Head Mountain to Mont Tête-Debout. And so it just seemed like kind of crazy. And so I actually, as part of the little volunteer committee to address this, had the chance to meet with Gérald Gaudin, which was really a wonderful experience. I never met Laurent, and I never met Lévesque, but I did have several meetings with Gaudin, and he was just like a fascinating guy. And you know, when we came and we presented and we were talking about these historic toponyms, place names that were about to be changed, he just kind of like, I remember we were down, he had an office down near the old port, and he just said something, I mean, I can't remember the exact words, it was something like, but this is crazy, you know, this is like crazy. So that was Gérald Gaudin. I really liked him.
So you were successful in stopping these changes?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we were successful, I think, in saying, with Godin, who was a poet, right? So we were successful, I think, with the minister in being able to say, no, this is part of Quebec's heritage, right? Like the English language place names are themselves a bien culturel. And yes, there need to be possibly processes for them to change if the people who live in those areas or those spaces or those towns decide they want to do that. I mean, that's a natural process. But to sort of do this sort of bureaucratic sort of like clearing of the map is just not acceptable. And the minister was sympathetic to that perspective. And so, yeah, I think we kind of backed the Commission de la Toponymie a bit off their plan.
Who got involved in the early years of Townshippers? Who formed that organization, and what were they doing in the earliest years? Like, what was the impetus aside from Camille Laray?
Well, I think it was sort of the standard things that were going on. Of course, in the organizing of the community over those years, there was always a strong focus on health and social services, right? That just falls out as a natural thing. The future of the Sherbrooke Hospital, already there were open questions about that. The future of Brome-Missisquoi. You know, there was the beginnings of the development of a much richer, the CLSC system was sort of starting to be put in place. Coming out of Montreal, there was the beginnings of serious work around legislative guarantees for access to health and social services in English. So that didn't, I mean, it took us a long time to kind of connect with the Montreal perspective on institutions and the importance of institutions, and it was a really, really important lesson, I think, us folks from the country got out of the Montrealers and their perspective on things. So health and social services was big. Cultural stuff, history stuff, the toponymy issue seized hold of people's attention, you know, like when you suddenly hear they're going to change the name of your town or the road you live on or whatever. Education was always a question, I mean, because, you know, schools were already becoming kind of fragile. We'd been through the boom or the peak, and already the decline in numbers in schools was very apparent. Everybody was still struggling after the exodus of people that had taken place prior to, and then, you know, there was an extra little bump after 101, so people were concerned about that. And concerned about the fact that it was primarily younger people and youth that were leaving in droves. So those were the kinds of issues, and the people who got involved was a whole array of people like Warren Grapes, who was just a great guy. He was a farmer from Sawyerville, Holstein breeder, just a wonderful guy. Jim Ross, Dr. Jim Ross, who was a surgeon at the Sherbrooke Hospital and a remarkable, remarkable leader. A whole array of people. But for the Townshippers itself, it was also to build these connections with, because the townships kind of breaks down into its own little territories, right? So for the people of the Sherbrooke area, getting to know the people from like Cowansville, Bedford, and getting then to know the people from Richmond, and then even people further north, because in the beginnings we were also trying to bring in Lac-Mégantic and like Megantic and Thetford, and so it was this whole kind of prise de conscience about who we were and what our links were and what was historically accurate, but what was like practically, you know, doable as a community in, what was that, 1980 or 1981.
So, and how closely involved was the Townshippers with Alliance Quebec at that time? Well, I guess Alliance Quebec came around a bit later, but...
Yeah, so it was the Council of Quebec Minorities. Yeah. And they already sort of were, you know, I think they were already thinking about something more like the Alliance. And so so it was, I mean, there's no other way to say it. It was difficult right at the beginning. And this is in the nature, I think, of just simple urban-rural relationships. Urban-rural relationships are always problematic and difficult. And my experience, because I spent so much time on these issues as the so-called off-island vice president and then as the president of Alliance Quebec, just kind of holding an organization together which is trying to straddle city and country is very, very, very difficult. And rural folks tend to think that city folks don't know about them or care about them. But the reverse is more often than not true. It's the rural folks who don't really care about the cities and the complexities of the cities or the challenges of the cities. So both kind of groups, when they think about each other, sort of tend to think the other doesn't think about them very much. So it was a bit of a struggle, but but I think it was the re-election of the Parti Québécois, right? Like everyone kind of walked through the first mandate sort of thinking, oh, this was an anomaly, and you know, the Union Nationale had collapsed, and suddenly we had this PQ government, and they did their crazy stuff, and a lot of it was delayed in terms of its implementation, right? But when the PQ won a second mandate, and then provisions of Bill 101 really started to hit, that's when everybody got like really kind of serious that we've got to do something here. And so in spite of those kind of almost structural difficulties, people found a way to kind of get together and overcome whatever resistances they had. And a lot of it was just driven by individuals. I mean, some individuals were more skeptical and hesitant about involving themselves with Montreal. And then there were other individuals who kind of threw themselves into it. I mean, I mentioned Dr. Ross, I mentioned Warren Grapes, and some others who were willing to do it.
What were your positions at Alliance Quebec over the years, and from beginning to end, basically?
I did a little bit of a fill-in once for their director of research, where I was actually on staff. That was the first kind of, I mean, as a board member of the Townshippers, as a volunteer, I started to become involved with the Council of Quebec Minorities. And there it was really just kind of generally representing Townshippers at occasional meetings, but started to meet some of the people who would, the staff people, I mean volunteers and staff people, Eric Maldoff, Jonathan, Michael Goldblum, some of their, I mean, like it's astonishing, eh? The staff people from Alliance Quebec who went on into politics and high-profile stuff. I mean, many of those people are already there. Tom Mulcair and Kathleen Weil. And, I mean, like the list goes on and on and on, right? Russ Williams. So it was starting to get to know them, but also starting to kind of like open myself to understanding the perspectives of the various Montreal communities who are represented there. And I think in terms of the organization of the community and understanding what it means to be community and starting to think strategically about how to position the community with respect to government and law and regulation development, it was really, more than anyone, I think, the people from the Jewish community who managed to kind of like bring this profound understanding about the importance of institutions and the protection of institutions and the investment in institutions and the defense of institutions, both in education and in health and social services. And so I really learned a lot from people like Maldoff and Goldblum and others who just kind of came out of like a community that got that, you know, like that understood it, that had, you know, unfortunate, but had lived that for so many generations that this was sort of like just instinctive and integral to how they approached community and thinking about community.
You mentioned the Council of Quebec Minorities, and that group was not organized around Anglophones or English speakers. When did that kind of English-speaking community consciousness emerge?
Well, the council was basically English-speaking. I mean, that was it. I mean, it was the earliest stuff, right? I mean, it was, you know, what happened was with the election of the Parti Québécois, like we were really young, eh? There was sort of a younger generation of people who just sort of recognized that an older elite generation just didn't know how to handle this and didn't kind of know what they were doing and didn't really know how to respond except to move their stock portfolios to Toronto and their homes to Kingston. And so here in Montreal, it was people like Maldoff and Goldblum and Michael Prupus with some other people slightly older. Ann Usher was like a critical leader in those days as well as here. And they started to then assemble with some resources, primarily from the federal government, that cadre of staff, Mulcair and Kathleen Weil and Von Dowie, Jeff Chambers, and that came together in the Council of Quebec Minorities. I mean, running alongside it was Positive Action, and Stores and Alec were always kind of like entertaining and remarkably effective, but they didn't have this vision of something bigger or something reaching out, something structured. And so they eventually kind of got swallowed into the Alliance. But it wasn't without a certain amount of indigestion in the organization, because Alec Patterson, and Stores too, but Alec Patterson was, he was special. He was special. No, he was just an incredible guy. All kinds of great leadership and just like good karma, but managing people of strong character can be a challenge.
What were the top 3 issues you worked on during your time at Alliance Quebec as a president? Or not necessarily as a president.
Yeah. Well, vice president, I mean, I mentioned, like as an aside, just kind of trying to hold the organization together just took up huge amounts of time. And that was just really small p politics, right? Because by that point it had become a pretty big organization, and we were present in all kinds of regions and had relationships with associations that remained completely autonomous, like Townshippers and Voice of English-Quebec in Quebec City. So that took a lot of time. And then we dealt with, things that when I came in as president in June of 1987, we sort of thought had been sorted out and were just going to kind of unfold without any problems. And that was the Signs case, and that was Meech Lake. And like, I actually think if people in the organization had known how both issues were going to unfold, I probably wouldn't have been invited to be president. I mean, I was asked to be president because I had more kind of community development experience, and the leadership actually thought, we've kind of got through the big politics, and so now we need to think about the survival of the organization as basically a community organization and a community building organization, and so let's get somebody who's got a background in that. And I've been executive director of the Townshippers for a few years, and I'd done the CBC show, like broadcasting to all of Eastern Quebec, and so they asked me to do that, but it just everything kind of went bad with both the Signs case and Meech Lake. And so the politics just started to heat up in a way that nobody really anticipated.
Tell us a little bit more about how things heated up.
Well, the Mulroney government was elected in '84, and Mulroney committed himself to bringing Quebec into the '82 Constitution. Mr. Lévesque decided it was a beau risque to do that, and that blew his party apart and blew his leadership up, ultimately, and the party threw him out like a piece of trash, which I will come back to in a moment. And then the Liberals were elected, and then, by April '87 was the famous meeting where the premiers all said, yes, we're going to do this. Trudeau launched his big offensive in May, and things were already like, oops, what are we facing here? They finally signed the first week of June in '87. So I became president of the Alliance the last week of June in '87. And I think it was the 28th, because it was the day before my birthday. So I actually became president of the Alliance when I was 30. It was like we were all really young, like all of us, which probably had something to do with how we led things, but there you are. And so specifically with Meech, it like the Trudeau criticism started to take hold amongst admirers and supporters of Trudeau. We had a number of admirers and supporters of Trudeau in Alliance Quebec. And so internally within Alliance Quebec, because we had come out and said, we're for Meech Lake. And Michael Goldbloom was the one who did that, and he did that, you know, when it came out that they were going to do this, and Michael Goldbloom maybe should have paid more attention to Mr. Levesque saying beau risque, but Michael said, and it became a real source of contention and criticism of him, said that at a certain point you have to take a leap of faith with the Constitution. And the concern was distinct society, if you recall, right? That was the sticking point, that was one of the the key demands of Bourassa and his government.
And veto as well.
Yeah, and those sorts of things. Yeah, there was a short list. But it was the distinct society where everyone seemed to be getting really nervous, not just here, but across the country. And when Trudeau came out with his criticism, that's when people started coming in. And for us to hold the line within the alliance that we were for Meech Lake required a huge amount of energy, like ongoing energy. Right until Meech Lake died, we were fighting that one, or sorting, continuously sorting it out within the organization. And we managed to stay publicly in support of Meech Lake right till it died. So that started right away within the organization. So we go into the fall, we get through the summer, we go into the fall, and Frank McKenna gets elected in New Brunswick in October. Because Dick Hatfield, I mean, he was then, he had been one of the signatories to Meech, and then all the marijuana smoking and the parties with men and stuff started to come out, and his leadership started to fall apart, and he couldn't push through approval of Meech Lake through his legislature because all the legislatures had to approve it. That was the political challenge. And McKenna came in, and McKenna had expressed some skepticism about the deal in the campaign, and when he was elected, said that there needed to be a renegotiation. And I actually, that winter, went to New Brunswick, went to Fredericton, and met with Mr. McKenna. And there's no other word for it. I pleaded with him not to back off on Meech Lake. I mean, I pleaded with them to please, please, please find a way to support Meech Lake, because if you don't, it is going to be terrible. For the country, for our community, for Quebec, I mean, it's going to be terrible. Please. So that was October. And then my perspective, I haven't seen anybody talk about this anywhere else but in these terms, but my perspective as president and my memory of it is still the same, that the death of René Levesque on November 1st changed everything in Quebec. It just changed everything. And I think it was because not only was it the loss of this extraordinary guy, but that there were some pretty deep levels of guilt and shame about how he had been treated at the end of his political career. Because they tossed him out. Like, they just threw him out, and he went to his condo on Nuns Island and just kind of hung out there. And like there was no big celebration of him. There was no, and then he was gone, like bang. And so there was this huge outpouring, which probably some of it would have happened at any point. But I think part of it was driven by this sense of, oh my God, we treated him so shabbily. And so then things just started to harden. We got the Court of Appeals decision on the Signs case. That's when signs start to come in.
And 78.
Yeah, and they kicked it, they kicked the can down the road to the Supreme Court, and that was a big surprise, right? So this is edging into Signs. We thought Signs was okay because we had a very strong decision by the Superior Court. We had, with the election of Bourassa, we had an unprecedented strength of ministers in the cabinet, like because we had Chacha, and we had French, and we had Lincoln, and we had Herb Marks. They said quietly to the Alliance that they had the pledge from the boss that he would go with what the courts decided, and was ready to sort of like even fix it at Court of Appeal. So we kind of thought it was like, that one was fixed too, right? Because we fought all kinds of other battles around Bill 101, but that was the big one in people's minds. And so Lévesque dies, Bourassa sends the science judgment, which again was like really strong out of the Court of Appeal, right? It was, if anything, even stronger than we got out of Superior Court. And so we had to go to the Supreme Court. And that happened when I was president. And so our lawyers, it was Hilton and Urosky were our lawyers, Harvey Urosky and Alan Hilton. And and so they argued, and then the decision came out. And all along the nationalist wing of the elite was, egging this up. And for me, I mean, with the Supreme Court judgment, that was huge. But the thing that I think was always missing in the discourse in Quebec, and in some ways it was strategic, in some ways I think it just people didn't pay attention to it, was our science case that the Alliance launched was based on the Quebec Charter. It wasn't really the Canadian Charter in the end. And even the Supreme Court judgment, if you look at, the judgment itself, or you look at the recollections of someone like Yves de Montigny, who argued for the government of Quebec, they're very clear. It was a Quebec Charter decision. And even Alan Hilton, I was looking just the other day at a press clipping from the time when Alan Hilton came out of the court after the judgment was rendered. He tried to sort of articulate that it was a judgment for the strength of the Quebec Charter and how this was an important decision reinforcing the Quebec Charter. But obviously that never took hold. And instead, the entire memory of the Supreme Court challenge, the entire memory about the Supreme Court judgment on signs is that the Canadian Charter overturned Bill 101.
So what was the judgment?
Well, the science case judgment was important in a bunch of ways for Canadian law generally, but specifically on the signs. And it was important in general terms because I think it was the first serious freedom of expression case to come before the court using the Canadian Charter. Because the Canadian Charter was also adduced, right? So it was brought in as well. And it also then made some important judgments about the use of the notwithstanding clause because the Quebec government, Lévesque's government, right after 82, had passed this omnibus notwithstanding bill, which basically said, the new charter doesn't apply to any Quebec laws. And so there were legal questions that had to be sorted about the Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, and there was the freedom of expression, the general issue of freedom of expression, and specifically whether commercial speech is included in the protections of freedom of expression. So that was kind of the heart of the legal issues. But the judgment was that Bill 101, requiring that French outdoor public signs be exclusively in French, was not consistent with the protection of the freedom of expression and non-discrimination protections in the Quebec Charter, as well as the Canadian Charter.
And how did it change Bill 101 going forward, this judgment?
Well, it didn't change Bill 101 at all because Mr. Bourassa decided to use the notwithstanding clause to protect Bill 101. And then it started into a long period, and to his enormous credit, Claude Ryan was given the job of figuring this out. Because the judgment had said not only was 101 as it existed not allowable under the Quebec and Canadian charters in terms of freedom of expression and non-discrimination, but that it was allowable to require the use of a language. And they basically said, and they also said, even to require the predominant usage of a language, which of course is where Mr. Ryan eventually got, right, in terms of thinking it through and figuring it out. And that then replaced it, you know, a few years later when they came in with the new legislation before they had to renew the notwithstanding clause, because the notwithstanding clause has to be renewed every 5 years. So that was sort of the clock ticking for Bourassa and Ryan to sort of figure this out, because they didn't want to kind of run into being forced to renew or be in a situation where a Liberal government had to renew the notwithstanding clause. And they found that solution, which was basically what the Supreme Court said was allowable under the Quebec Charter and the Canadian Charter. And that resolution, that compromise, lasted for basically 30 years until the CAQ came into power.
So you were there in a period clearly of political tension.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the fire in the
God.
AQ office in 1988.
Well, we had the judgment, the science judgment was in December of '87. Bourassa's decision to use the notwithstanding clause to protect Bill 101 was also in December. And, you know, so it was huge and it was big and everyone was concerned and upset, and then it was Christmas. And so there was a Christmas break. And so everyone kind of went home and the offices more or less shut down. And I had arranged to meet with a friend in Montreal during the Christmas break. Excuse me. I came to Montreal, I drove in from the Townships, and I went to the offices because I got there a little bit early, and like I had a key, and so I went to the offices and I did a bit of work because we were already starting to plan what we were going to do in the new year, because the community clearly expected something to be done, at least, you know, to bring people together to talk about it, which is sort of what we did. And that day, I left the offices and I went down Crescent Street to meet a friend at a bar to have a drink, a Christmas drink, a pre-Christmas drink, a post-Christmas drink. I can't remember exactly what day it was. And yeah, I came out, when I finished, I came out of the bar and I looked up the street, and there was smoke billowing out of our building. Anyway, and then that started into a whole strange experience of police investigations and libelous press reporting and fire commissioner investigations and yeah, lots of stuff. Many lawyers working for me at that point in my life, to whom I was enormously grateful. And I have to say, there were like people who deserved to be recognized in these things. Peter Blakey was the chair of Alliance Quebec while I was the president, and man, oh man, you know, you want Peter Blakey to have your back if you're in a bar fight, let me tell you. Not just because he's big, but man, he just was great. Michael Goldblum, Dr. Victor Goldblum, Sheila Moore, Kathleen Weil. I mean, there were people who just made that bearable, but it was difficult.
So you were brought in to do some community organizing, but then you got embroiled into this whole battle around rights and constitutional issues. And that's been kind of one of the criticisms that's been laid out at AQ. It was too focused on rights and not enough on community development. Did you have time to do community development? Do you think that's a fair criticism? Do you think?
No, I don't think it's a fair criticism at all. Because I mean, the organization was like well staffed with people who were working on these things, and I mean, I think it also has to do with like how do you define community organizing, and what work is at the heart of community organizing. So while we were battling those big high-profile things about signs and Meech Lake and all that kind of stuff, that was a relatively small portion of the effort of our staff and the organization. Because at the same time we were advancing on issues of health and social services, for example. I mean, I mentioned it, that the work that the Alliance did and people like Russ Williams and other staff people did around legislative guarantees for health and social services were like extraordinary, and the impact has been with us and with the community ever since. So everything we see, like access plans and the advisory committees of at the provincial level to the minister, that all came out of Alliance Quebec work in terms of putting in place those legislative guarantees. I mean, we'll see what happens with Santé Quebec with all those structures, but reste à voir. And similarly in education, there was a lot of work that was going on. That was difficult. Like, it was really hard to work in the education sphere. I mean, the school boards rightly, the school boards have a legitimacy that others don't have, right? I mean, they're constitutionally recognized, and they are democratically elected, and all those sorts of things that are important for it. But, we also went through that whole period when we were doing things like, getting rid of the confessional school board system and trying to figure out ways to integrate communities that had not necessarily worked together, and battling about access issues. And so we were kind of in that stuff as well. And at the same time then we were working, and Mulcair actually did a lot of this work at the very beginning when he started with the Alliance, but others came along and did it as well. No, not Mulcair. Mulcair did the legal stuff. I meant to say, how could I have forgotten this name? John Paracella worked for us too, right? And Paracella was running this whole effort to create, we called them chapters, but chapters across the province. And I can't remember how many chapters we developed, but there was like a lot of them. And all of them sort of set up with, volunteer committees and programming and linkages to the central organization. And many of them, formed the nucleus of what would become all the organizations that continue to exist and are part of the QCGN now. So, whether you're talking about more legislative regulatory stuff that you're watching on behalf of the community and its institutions, or actually hands-on, like kind of organizing people and getting them to work together, I think there was a lot that was done. And people, it never had as high a profile. Even stuff like, legislative guarantees of health and social services could never compete with signs and Meech Lake.
Right. Alliance Quebec was largely funded by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
What was the relationship of Alliance Quebec with Francophones and the Quebec government over the years, and how did that change?
I guess you'd have to say it was kind of complicated. The Alliance managed to work with governments of all stripes, right? I mean, it alternated between Liberal and PQ. I mean, we didn't have CAC and all the other ones. So they always, like in the early years, they always found time, always found a way to work with the government, and always, I think you could pretty consistently point to progress being made on a range of things. During Eric Maldoff's time, big focus on health, big focus on, in some cases, how 101 affected healthcare workers and the availability of healthcare workers, but just access, CLSC structures, all those kinds of things. Michael Goldbloom did some remarkable work with the new Mulroney government at the time, and I think was more responsible than anybody, certainly from our community, in the shape of the Second Official Languages Act, which again has created, arguably created this, right? And Michael Goldbloom actually came up with the word vitality in terms of the word in the Second Official Languages Act, in terms of what the Official Languages Act was designed to do, which was to enhance the vitality of official language communities. And that whole of government approach and all those roadmaps and everything out of which spilled so many good things for our community, that came out of Mulroney and the Second Official Languages Act, and Michael Goldbloom did huge amounts of work in making sure that was, focused in a way which would benefit communities across the country. So yeah.
How did the relationship change with the regional groups?
Oh, I'm sorry. We were talking about
we were talking about Quebec government, but
that's but and so the Quebec government, we always had friendly and productive relationships. It would vary from time to time depending on the leader or the specific minister you had to deal with, but that's just part of politics, right? Some ministers are more open to you, some ministers have a different perspective, some ministers don't. We were sometimes criticized by the political people themselves, the ministers saying, people like Reed Scowen and Richard French, like their criticism of us was that we weren't more they wanted us to be more aggressive. They wanted us to be, to cut the issues much more sharply, to be much less willing to find, the compromise or to work within the framework of modern Quebec, because that would make their job easier, because they wanted to play that role within their party, right? To say, I've got Alliance Quebec over here, and we got the Nationals wing of the party over here, and oh my God, what are we going to do? So that was their criticism. But walking that fine line meant that on the one hand you were criticized by people like French and others, and it was the second official language. And there again, one of the unrecognized, I think, contributions of Mulroney to national unity and to the health of our communities. I mean, that was very much Brian Mulroney, and I suspect that's because he came from Baie-Comeau and had kind of lived the experience of being a minority community. He was very, very sensitive to those kinds of issues.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about the 1988 revision of the Official Languages Act, AQ's role in that, and what changed for the English-speaking community with that revision.
So Mr. Mulroney had quite early on, I think, expressed his intention to do this and worked away at it, and so the Alliance was involved, especially through Michael Goldbloom, who was president 85 to 87, in all the preliminary work to it, and was responsible for some key terminology and some key concepts within it. So the big difference with the Second Official Languages Act was that rather than concentrating on individuals and their linguistic rights with respect to their interactions with the federal government or federal departments or agencies, this really adopted this community focus, kind of recognizing that it was a responsibility of the federal government to try to ensure the vitality, and that's a word that Michael Goldbloom came up with, to assure the vitality of the communities that actually use these languages, because it's a little bit artificial to say that you're supporting two official languages just by making sure that I can use French or English when I call the federal government. And from that came, then beyond that, not so much with, Mulroney sort of pointed in that direction, but then it was when we got the next Liberal government, they adopted this whole of government approach, whereby every department and agency was expected to make a contribution to the vitality of the official language minority communities. And so out of that then spilled all of the support that's come forward for groups like Community Health and Social Services Network, and that whole panoply of organizations.
So funding increased for English-speaking community organizations as a result of the 1988?
Massively.
Okay.
Massively. And some departments got out ahead of it faster, so Health Canada was out there quickly, and that's why I think we have such a developed relationship with them. The Canadian Heritage still had a bit of a primary responsibility and was critical, but Justice and others were also moving into this space as well. It's taken a long time for that all to kind of actually work, but that kind of focus on communities, whole of government approach, that really came out of the Second Official Languages Act and Alliance Quebec, and specifically Michael Goldbloom, Kathleen Weil, who was then our Director of Legal Affairs, and others there. they were really critically involved with that. And we had built, and I spent actually quite a bit of time doing this, we'd built some pretty good relationships with Francophone organizations across the country, especially the Western ones, because they were also battling through language issues at that point, the Franco-Manitobans and the Franco-Albertans, the Francescois. And we had really good relationships with them. We had slightly touchy relationships with the Franco-Ontarians, and we had like no relationship with the Acadians. But that's just the attitudes they had to English Quebec. I mean, because it's been a struggle, and to this day, many people refuse to recognize that we have anything to complain or be subsidized about. I was just much stronger at the beginning.
Yeah, that's interesting. The relationships were stronger with the West than with
yeah, and as I say, because they were smaller, and like we did stuff like intervene in court cases with them, in court battles, and on critical questions like the translation of legislation in Manitoba, where we went to the Supreme Court and supported them actively. So we were really kind of engaged with the folks in the West, and that bore some fruit. And we kept making efforts with the Ontarians, Franco-Ontarians, and the Acadians, but yeah, that was harder, much harder nut to crack.
So, Alliance Quebec, can you tell us about the evolution of relationships with regional groups? You said it was difficult at the beginning. I think it was difficult at the end, too.
It was very difficult at the end.
Tell us a little bit about that.
The Signs case was a real, represented a real sea change for the English-speaking community, I think it's fair to say. I left before the end of my complete term and went to CJD just because the opportunity arose and I wasn't going to say no. And Peter Blakey actually filled in for the remaining, what was it, like 3 months or something of my term. But the criticism had already started before the Signs case, and then it really ramped up. It was led by, a couple of key columnists, Bill Johnson most famously, who accused me and others of being the lamb lobby on behalf of the English-speaking community. I think that had already started with Michael Goldblum, continued with me. The resignation of the 4 ministers after the use of the notwithstanding clause in the Signs case. Did 4 resign or did only 3 resign? There was Marx, Lincoln, French, Chacha stayed, so it was 3. And the outrage of at the Liberal Party then created the Equality Party movement. And so the Equality Party then moved onto the scene. And so there just suddenly started to be like a lot more voices, right? Alliance Quebec sort of held the field for quite a while, for a good, 6 years or so. But these critical voices, and voices suggesting that we weren't strong enough, aggressive enough, that we should be continuing to fight, like that, we shouldn't be even contemplating the notion that it was acceptable to have predominance of the French language, that all languages should be equal, and it's that those voices were coming up, and that we mishandled the relationships with the government, we mishandled the legal strategies. The Equality Party was this sort of surge of protest. The Alliance had much more difficulty finding a space, and it just slowly started to kind of come apart. And then Bill Johnson was elected, and that was kind of basically, it wasn't the beginning of the end, but it was sort of the last chapter, when everybody, especially the federal government, said, if this is where the Alliance is going, we don't want to be there.
So when did you stop being involved with Alliance Quebec? Was it when you went to CJAD, or were you still involved at that point?
No, I went to CJAD, and that was just like as a matter of, they didn't insist on it when I got there, but I felt I had to do it, right? That I basically, because, I was I was dealing with the same issues. I mean, I kept dealing with the same issues. I just did it on a talk show for 3 hours a day. But it was all the same stuff, you know, like what's happening to Meech and so on and so forth. And I mean, like CJD was a great experience. But I personally decided I've had it with the Alliance. And I have to say, personally, I felt I'd sort of, you know, I'd done my time on the issue, especially after the whole signs and fire and all that kind of stuff. So I just sort of said, it's closed, that's it, no more contact. I mean, obviously I knew people and still talked with people, but I wasn't involved in any formal way with the Alliance at all.
How did being involved in Alliance Quebec affect your life afterwards?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, my life would have been so much different without Alliance Quebec. I might still be a shepherd in the townships, you know. I mean, I would never have gotten the CJD job without the profile that I got from the Alliance, or, you know, from that job into the CBC jobs that I had after that, or the TV jobs I had after that. All the people that I met became just my best friends to this day. Connections I'd made there were connections that became the base of my working life in communications and other things. Michael Goldblum's brother Donovan and others. It's hard for me to imagine. It's hard for me to overemphasize how the Alliance Quebec experience changed the directions or set the directions of my life. And I think too, it was very intense, right? Just very intense. I mentioned that the community expected us to do something as we headed into 1989. And we set up a whole series of public meetings. And they were big. I mean, there was a debate internally of whether we should rent the forum and fill the forum and just have like a huge rally. And we were, the top leadership, we resisted that idea because we were afraid of violence. Because we were getting death threats. And, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, I was, on the advice of the Montreal police, I was being driven around by an armed driver in a car. That was like 2 months of my life was with my armed driver. My house had guards on it for 2 months on the advice of the police. And so we had this series of meetings. So we resisted the forum, and we instead had these more decentralized meetings. And we had one of them in downtown Montreal, and this was like really early on in '89, and it was at I don't know what it's called now, but it was called the Shangri-La Hotel on Sherbrooke Street. It's got a different name, but it's like a big modern hotel. And so when we were getting ready for that meeting, it was the first big one that we had, and I was writing this speech for it because we'd been burned out, so we were in temporary residence at a hotel on René Lévesque where we set up our offices. And I was writing this speech, and Michael and Victor Goldblum were helping me write the speech. Victor, because he was helping with the French language component. Victor Goldblum's French was just wonderful. And Kathleen Weil knocked on the door, and she came in with the news that TVA and the Journal were going to go with the news that night that I was the suspect of the arson. I remember that moment, just like, oh my God, what's happening here? What is this? So anyway, we held it together, and anyway, I held it together. We got out, and I got in my car, and we drove to the hotel, and there was a lot of people had shown up. Like there were a lot of people. It was sort of a convention space in the hotel. And there was, I heard later, out in the lobby, the journalists were all arrayed, and what was the name of the little newspaper that started up and ran for a while? George McLaren ran it. Québécois sponsored it. The Montreal. You don't remember? It was a daily tabloid, and George McLaren was the publisher, and anyway. But they were really feisty journalists. They were tabloid style journalists. And I heard afterwards that out in the lobby, that the reporters from this little English tabloid got in a fist fight with the TVA reporters because the rumor was starting to circulate that TVA was going to say that I was the suspect for the arson. Anyway, so we get to the hotel and they decide that they're going to bring me in to the hotel because it's so busy and the lobby is crazy and they don't want me to be scrummed about this rumors from TVA. They decide to bring me in through the kitchen. And I'm coming in through the kitchen and I flash that one of my earliest memories as a kid was watching a news story when Robert Kennedy was shot in the kitchen of a hotel by Sirhan Sirhan because they were bringing him in to do a speech in the hotel, which is like a crazy thing to have thought, because not for an instant did I think I was going to be like Robert Kennedy, but still that's what's flashed in my mind, and there's this pressure cooker stuff. And I have to say too that was the meeting where it was like crazy, so crazy getting in there. But when I realized, I think accurately, that sometimes you're in a position where the most important thing you can do, it doesn't matter what you say, but you just are able to stand up there and look like you're holding it together. And so we got through that. And I went out through the kitchen to leave. And TVA did the thing, and then I launched my lawsuit against them. And so then I went to CJD, yeah.
Great. Are you still involved in community organizing for English-Speaking Quebec?
I still do some work occasionally for the Community Health and Social Services Network in Quebec City. And I'm very involved with the United Church still, and so I'm involved on the board of the Montreal City Mission here in Montreal, which does primarily legal services for refugees and people with precarious immigration status. So we do that. So I kind of think of that as kind of community stuff, but that's basically what I do. And I do a lot of volunteer work with the nursing school of McGill in East Africa.
And what do you think about the way the community is organized today, like compared to when there was Alliance Quebec, this big kind of umbrella group? Now there's QCGN, there's CHSSN, there's different groups kind of. Was it better then? Is it better now? How has it changed?
Well, the vision, when they set up the Alliance, I was watching, I wasn't a decision maker with the Alliance when they were setting up the Alliance Quebec structure. They kind of intentionally structured it a little bit like a political party, right? You know, with annual conventions and policy committees and policy voting. I mean, they had this whole huge policy book, right, that went on for hundreds of pages in terms of like very precise policies about all aspects of a community and community life. And then the chapters were basically, you know, like riding associations kind of thing in terms of just the sort of mental model of what it was going to be. That took a lot of energy to sustain. All of those tensions that, you know, we have talked about between rural, urban, and then just personality-driven tensions meant that there was a big job just to kind of hold it together. And then towards the end, as the Alliance started to kind of spin out of control, then everybody kind of realized how potentially problematic this could be if you've got kind of different sort of leadership. And so in the end, when they killed off the Alliance and created QCGN, they intentionally created a structure that wouldn't be centralized and wouldn't be a powerful voice and couldn't presume the support of the regions or the regional organizations through a policy process and a voting process. So I think that was kind of intentional at the time, right? To not have a single voice. I don't know. I mean, I don't think Alliance Quebec was necessarily sustainable. I think when the pressures came off the community, it's hard to motivate people to stay involved in that at that kind of level. So I don't know if there was an alternative path that could have been different and might have shaped things differently. I mean, as I say, when the Science case happened, there was then so many voices out there, and people were putting their hopes in the Equality Party or like whatever they were putting their hopes in, and that created also a complex space within which it was hard for the Alliance to survive.
Can you tell us a bit about CJAD and its importance for the community?
CJAD was a wonderful experience. I was there for almost 4 years, and I did the morning talk show. And I'd never done a talk show before. I don't think they knew if I could. They just knew I had a high profile at that point. And Joe Cannon, who was my predecessor, had left for a job in the States. And they were looking for somebody with a profile, and they offered me the job. And so I got to CJD, and it was sort of like, I always think the experience of being at CJD, the years I was there, was like riding around in a late 1950s Cadillac convertible. It was like big and cushy, and the guys who were on air were sort of like almost like an older generation of broadcaster, Gord Sinclair and George Balkan, like really talented people and just great to work with. And partly it had that feel because unlike every other market in Canada, somehow CJAD had held on to its audience as an AM station. And all the kind of the splitting of audience that had happened in virtually every other market in Canada just hadn't happened here. And I think it was because of the nature of the community, but also the kind of relationship CJAD had with these folks, that you just had this sense that you were in the bedrooms of your average English Quebecer, Montrealer, English Montrealer, when you were broadcasting at CJAD, and you were getting these phone calls that were coming in, and you were hearing the voices and hearing the perspectives. And yeah, whether it's because the audience just didn't move on like all other English audiences in Canada, or because CJAD was doing something special to maintain the relationship with its audience, both in terms of content and relationship, I don't know what it was, but it was atypical in the broadcast world. And you could really feel it when you were on air with CJAD, that this was like a community station that people were turning to. And so like I have often thought it would bear some real investigation, like how did CJAD build that, and how did they sustain it so long? And how did they kind of avoid where radio was going in many other markets in terms of, shock jocks and attack stuff and all those things. Yeah, CJAD was a real education and just a huge privilege to be part of that team.
Yeah, any final thoughts about how the community has changed over the years, both in the townships and maybe in the townships? I mean, we know a lot about Montreal, but
oh, well, we continue to get older and smaller. We're lucky that we're in a part of Quebec. Well, look, first of all, as a minority community, we're lucky we're in Quebec, right? There really is un gros bon sens at work here in Quebec. Bernie Samaras always uses that phrase to describe it. Like, ultimately, I would talk with Bernie often because Bernie grew up in the village next to the village I grew up in. And Bernie, would always just sort of say, like, yeah, you got to pay attention to what's happening in the National Assembly and in the headlines in the Montreal papers, but like, let's recognize the real nature of Quebec society and what it's like to be here. And there is this good old bon sens that comes out. I felt it too, you know, like, and I didn't mention this before, but with the craziness around signs and the arson stuff and all those things, and it kind of blew out of control. And then it was just like a couple of days later, it was first the mayor of Montreal who did it, and then several people came forward and said, like, you know, ça fait pas, like, this isn't how we do things in Quebec, and like, what happened here? I remember it was the mayor who first said that. I wish I could remember his name. He had a big mustache.
Jean Doré.
Yeah, Jean Doré. And so Jean Doré, like, he was the first one who said it. It was like just a couple of days after. Like, what the heck is this? And then there were other people who sort of did the same. And then, you know, La Presse came in, as one would hope and expect. And I was grateful for that. La Presse sort of like championed that this was like bad journalism, and how you know, where was the editorial control, and so it turned into a whole debate. So all that to say that, you know, I think we are lucky as a minority to be a minority in Quebec. I think the society truly is democratic, and even though we fight about notwithstanding clauses and charters of rights, I personally feel sad that the Quebec Charter never really took hold in the minds of Quebecers as part of what we are, like a profound, deep part of what we are, that there isn't more pride about the Quebec Charter, that we should be like René Lévesque, right? When he was so proud of the Charter that he sent a copy to every home in the province when they did some major upgrade of it, that just like never took hold. And thank God that René Lévesque fought through with Camille Lorrain and insisted that the Charte de la langue française would be subject to the Charte des droits et libertés de la personne. But somehow, and the courts, as I understand it, the courts resisted it because they couldn't figure out how it would apply with the civil code, and it was just too complicated. But I really, really wish that had been the case, because I think it is a reflection of the democratic instincts of Quebec and Quebecers. All that to say that, especially in the townships, you know, for the English-speaking minority, you're older and you're a little more fragile, and you're saddened to see young people leave still. But we do it in a community where, you know, the community is still respected and seen as an important part of the community, and people rise to the defense. I mean, the university crisis we just went through, how the local Francophone elite responded in support of Bishop's University, like, to me, is a real good example of how it is. I mean, it's also a function of we're so small, and we're not a threat to anybody. And we're sort of like, and we built nice houses 200 years ago that are cute and part of our patrimoine. But still, it's a good place to be as a minority community.